Okay. Anna, Lynn, your thoughts about the context when you first learned about the case, and what did you learn about the case?
So I think mine was kind of similar to Anna's in that I learned mine also like freshman year of college. I think I learned it, if I remember correctly, was from a student organization I was interested at the time called Asian Pacific American Student Organization at Michigan State, which stands for APASO. And I think one of the really unique things was that APASO had a room, and their room was called the Vincent Shin Memorial Room. And I was really curious as to why the room was named after Vincent Shin. So I like talked to my friend who was on the board, who gave me like a quick rundown of like the history. And then later on, I did my own search because I was really curious as to why like I never learned about this in the classrooms, or no one else in my community ever talked about it. So then after that, I started like taking Asian Pacific American history course at State, and where I learned more about that, more about the case in my class. And then we also watched a documentary called Who's Vincent Shin? And so that was just like another kind of like a daunting moment where a lot of people like myself, like in our age group, didn't really know who Vincent Shin was, but he's someone very, very important to our community with like just kind of how we move forward for like as a community coming together, but also just fighting for his case for justice. And like even to today, there really wasn't justice for his case after as Helen and Jim and Roland, all of you are here fighting for his justice, like it never happened. So to this day, I really hold this case really dear to my heart because I think it was the first time for me where I really learned about injustice and how important like my community is to me, and how much more we still have to do for our community with everything that's going on.
That's great. So next question, and I'd like to pose it to Helen and Jim. What was the climate like for Asian American organizing during and in the aftermath of the Vincent Shin case? Helen, you can start. Yeah, you wrote a book about it, right? Asian American Dreams.
Yeah, that's a chapter in my book, and that's one of the reasons the whole experience of being in Detroit and being an organizer around the injustice toward Vincent Shin and the whole community. That's one of the reasons I wrote that book. And I just want to say how amazing and heartwarming it is to hear Anna Dang and Anna Lynn talk about a whole nother generation and what this case meant to both of you in learning about it. And, you know, to the question of what the climate was like then, if you can imagine the newer generations listening to this talk now, the community was even more invisible then than now. I mean, back then there were about 2 to 3 million Asian Americans in the whole country, and most lived in, you know, places like Chinatowns or little Tokyos or little Indias and Manila towns, or the state of Hawaii and California. And in a place like Michigan, we were just totally invisible. When the case happened, and one of the very first meetings we had, there were about 10 Asian American attorneys who came to that meeting. And that was almost all of the Asian American attorneys in the entire state of Michigan. And the rest of the country pretty much reflected that, because up until, you know, the increasing numbers of Asian Americans and our generation moving forward, you know, Asian American professionals, whether you were in engineering or medicine or law, were pretty much barred from being admitted and accepted. So it was really a different time where we saw nobody in the news anywhere. And then this happened. And there was one news story that was shocking, I think, to all of us, because it showed a picture of an Asian American, Vincent Shin. And the article shortly after, June 19th, shortly after, 4 days later, Vincent was removed from life support, and he died from what happened today, 39 years ago. And it was shocking to even see a picture of an Asian American in a newspaper or and that was all. It wasn't in the TV news or anything like that. And so what else was happening was there was a climate of hate, very similar to what's going on today, that followed the collapse of the auto industry and all of manufacturing. And I want to point out that that was in at least year 3 of a terrible, terrible economic crisis. Millions of people were out of work. I was one of them because I had worked in the auto industry, and people were incredibly frustrated, suffering, not knowing that they would ever have another job as well-paying as the auto industry had been. And so in that climate of hate that we all felt like we had a target on our heads. And in that climate of hate, there's an article that shows that, it's like in all of my years up until then living in Detroit, I had never seen an Asian American appear in the news ever. And it was about a young man named Vincent Shin who had been beaten to death and how tragic it was. There was nothing about the racism. It was just how tragic it was that his 400 wedding guests went to his funeral instead. And so that was the climate. And so out of that, though even the words Asian American didn't really exist within our communities, among college students, among activists, yes, but among, restaurant workers, laundry workers, just, professionals, nobody talked about being Asian American. It was all, I'm Chinese American, or I'm Japanese American, or Vietnamese American, and all of our different ethnicities. And so that was the point where we all felt, wherever we were, that whatever happened to Vincent Shin, what happened to him could have been any one of us. And the tragedy was that it happened to him. And his mother, Lily Chin, was there to speak up about it. And we came together, and she, through her grief, had the courage to stand up over and over again and to say, I want justice for my son. I don't want any other mother to go through this agony. And so the climate was very much against us. And 1983, when the sentence was rendered, there was no internet. There weren't even fax machines, let me put it that way. So being able to reach out and find people around the country who could support us and reach out to other Asian Americans, that was all stuff that Roland and Jim and I and a lot of other people in the community just, hit the phones and contacted everybody we could think of. And I guess the other thing I'll say before turning it over to Jim is that we were about your age. So a lot of us who were activists at that time, we were the younger generation. Each of us here had become aware of Asian Americans when we were college students and had learned, as you did, about the fact that there was a history that we had been denied, that we had been deprived of. And we knew that every other American, including everybody in Detroit, pretty much had no idea who Asian Americans were, or the fact that Asian Americans experience racism. That was, one of the things even today, there's a lot of people who think, we are the model minority according to that racist myth. Well, that existed then. We were either the enemy or we were the quiet people who should stay quiet. And so we had to, as young activists then, come together, figure out a way to bring our communities together, to reach out to other communities, especially, communities of conscience, the Black civil rights community, the Anti-Defamation League, all of these other communities that wanted to support us, the faith communities. And because of our experiences in college, as you have experienced, we took those lessons and started trying to build something, a movement for justice. And it was against all of that climate. So let me stop there. But it's very similar to today, and the kind of things you are doing today from what you have learned. I mean, that's going to take us the next level forward. So I'm very excited that both of you are not only on this panel, but doing the kind of work that you're doing.
Yeah, Jim, I posed the same question to you about climate, but I also wanted to have you address the issue of the legal issues about whether race is a factor. Did race apply? That was really a matter of debate, during the Vincent Shin case. But then thinking forward, it's also applicable to the Atlanta killings, whether race was a factor or something else. And, can you address that as well?
Sure.
The legal issues.
Sure. One of the biggest challenges we faced back in 1983 was whether or not civil rights laws apply to Asian Americans. As you may know, historically, the Anti-Lynching Laws and Civil Rights Act of 1964, all which is the backdrop and the basis for the prosecution, were based upon discrimination, racism, and physical attacks against African Americans. So, and I'm sure if you look at the history of the Civil Rights Acts and the different statutes that were passed, they were never intended to be encompassing, racist acts against Asian Americans. Now, mind you, and I think I mentioned this before on other occasions, this is not a recent event. We look at the history going back to the, Chinese Exclusion Act, World War II, with Japanese Americans being incarcerated, and the fact that you've had this long history of barring interracial marriage, housing, you name that. Our history kind of parallels that. But again, when it came down to the time to whether or not we are defined as being a protected class of people, we were never really part of that. And one of the biggest challenges we had was trying to convince lawyers, local law enforcement, but also the Department of Justice that we have a meaningful role. And this is a type of situation which demands the attention of the federal government. And I know that the late Lisa Chen, who was the lead lawyer at the time, spent weeks and months trying to develop a game plan, which included interviews and information to be presented to the Department of Justice to convince them of trying to bring forward a civil rights prosecution. So historically, the case was important because this was the first time in history a civil rights prosecution was being pursued by the Department of Justice on behalf of an Asian American. So that's a breakthrough in itself. And I tell people, even though we didn't win in the end because Evans and Nitz walked on the charges, it laid the groundwork to where there's a level of understanding and consciousness about how Asian Americans stand in society that I think is sort of the benchmark to this very day. I think if you look at the African American experience, there's a lot of parallels. You talk about things like Jim Crow or Dred Scott, and going forward to things like Brown versus Board of Education, which created integration and the boycotts because of Rosa Parks. But the one event that in the modern era seems to have gotten new traction is Emmett Till because of the killing. In a lot of ways, the Chin case is that the Emmett Till event for the Asian American community. Everything you see now going on, including Atlanta, kind of flows from that event back in 1982. But unfortunately, history repeats itself, and because of the current climate, especially because of the trade war and because of the coronavirus, these are all things that have really ramped up and made the atmosphere very toxic. And as I think, as Helen just said, you have no idea how bad it was around here. We had car bashings. These auto workers would have these Japanese cars. They'd get a hammer and beat it up. And you think about it, there isn't much of a logical leap from that to somebody beating Vincent up with a baseball bat. You had protest rallies. You had, politicians, talking about calling us little yellow people and all kinds of things at the time. So even though that was the 1980s, as far as the time era, the current environment is almost as toxic, if not worse, because it's on a much larger scale. And as I've said more than once, things are bad. It's going to get a lot worse, folks, before things get better, because I think we're just starting to get into that early wave of anti-Asian sentiment, given what's going on with the trade war and global politics. So this is all part of a big picture. We're just one part of it. But from the standpoint of our community, I'm glad, by the way, Anna and Anna are involved, because this is something that it's like history repeating itself. No matter how hard we try and how long we battled, we're all pretty young. Now we're all kind of old, Helen and I. But the fact is the battle hasn't changed much. You still got large forces out there. Fortunately, we had a president we just got rid of that was part of the problems too, as far as kind of fanning the flames of racism. So for all of us, I think it's important that we kind of refocus and understand that this is history repeating itself, and we have to, more or less consolidate and have the forces, whether within our community and also building coalition with other groups that are impacted by this kind of venom and xenophobia, get organized. Because again, it's going to get a lot worse before it gets a lot better.
Can I ask Helen or you, Jim, just to explain sort of the activism that went on? It wasn't merely writing or doing pamphlets, but there was actually active communication with the FBI, with the DOJ. So it helped to define the character of the case because of that, intervention by American Citizens for Justice and the Justice for Vincent Shin campaign. I think it's important for people to recognize that occurred. Helen or Jim, do you want to just comment on that?
Sure. Coming from, as Jim was saying, a climate where there were just so many, I don't even know, barriers or just so many things stacked up against us, including that we were completely invisible. And, people would, literally reporters, people would, oh, you Asian Americans, A, where did you come from? B, what's making you so upset? So somebody got beaten to death. Literally, we had to start from scratch and do Asian Americans 101. Like, yes, we're here. Yes, some of us are newer immigrants and some have been here for generations. And yes, we do speak English and we are Americans. Literally, kindergarten over and over again. And so we knew that was the work we had to do, educating people, whether it was, in the federal government, the DOJ, members of Congress, local city council people, go to different churches, stand out in front of supermarkets and hand out flyers, go to schools, union halls. We did all of that. And we didn't have social media. And in a way that forced us to have to do it face to face. And even with social media today, and I talk to many young activists, social media is great. You can reach a lot of people, but when it comes to getting somebody to show up and to say, we're having a demonstration on May 9th, 1983, can you be there? Being able to say that in person and have them say, and what can I do? How can I support? And to be able to have that, one-on-one communication. That's what we did. We were, this was our job. We had day jobs. We had to pay the rent and figure out a way to pay our bills. But we also every day did, not just us, but, everybody who was involved really, did the hard work. We went on Black radio stations and had answered talk show questions where people would call in and say, you Asian Americans, you're talking about civil rights. What do you have to do with civil rights? Are you just riding on the coattails of the Black civil rights movement? And we answered those questions and we were humble and we talked about what it was that we had done that people had no idea that Asian Americans had done and had been part of the American fabric and contributed to, for example, Brown versus the Board of Ed. One of the legal bases that was based on was a case in the 1800s involving a Chinese American. And so these were things we had to talk about and to say, we're not just asking for help, we will be there too. We have had Asian Americans fighting for civil rights. Maybe that's been invisible because we've been invisible by, this systemic racism. But we are here and we had to do that work. So yes, that was part of what we had to do. And I would say that's part of what we have to do today. That part of organizing never goes away. Human beings need to have that communication with each other.
Got a question for you, Helen, or Jim. Just how important was it to make it to the Phil Donahue show or to have the article in the New York Times and actually having an audience with the Civil Rights Division?
Jim, do you want to take that one?
Sure. I think the one thing that is you have to understand at the time is that to get the visibility was almost like a full-time job. And it's fortunate that Helen had the time at the time. I know you're kind of between jobs and all and had more time on your hands to do that but for that, this never would have happened. I think, in fact, that meeting you had with that reporter from the New York Times was really sort of the seminal moment that really gave traction to the entire movement at that point in time. But the other part of it too is just the hard thing was trying to convince politicians and law enforcement of how important this was. I mean, there was like Helen was saying, a very large, very steep learning curve to try to get, authority. I mean, the press is one thing. The other thing too is the fact that the local politicians wouldn't listen to us. It wasn't for Horace Sheffield, who was a leader in the Black community, we never would have gotten a meeting with Cahalan, the prosecutor, and never had an ability to get the attention of Judge Kaufman, who did the probation sentence. And it sounds pretty, simplistic now. Saying, well, now we've got people in the legislature, we've politicians like that. We had nothing going for us. Literally, we were begging on all fours, trying to get the attention of law enforcement, politicians, and the media. And for the longest time, it was a full-time battle just to maintain control over the messaging, because people would come up with these ideas and they would kind of broadcast stuff, and we'd have to constantly correct them and be almost like the Truth Squad to try to get the record straight like that. So it's a big battle that way. And really, the culmination was not because of any great desire by the Department of Justice. They got flooded with phone calls and messages. And I was told by one person, I think we had the new record at that time, of over 15,000 calls, messages, and letters being sent to DOJ. So they knew that people were really angry about that, and they had to do something about it. So
right.
It's really a combination of forces that brought this to the forefront. And but getting back to the Downey show, that was huge. I mean, millions of people saw that. It was really hard. Mrs. Shin, I wasn't there, but I know Helen can explain it. For someone who is not a non-English speaker to have to go on national TV on a show like that, very difficult. And this is sort of anecdotal, but kind of funny. To show you the reach of that show, we were getting letters for months and years afterwards from people in prison and jail asking for help from ACJ because of the notoriety of that. But that broadcast probably maybe one of the most important things that happened, because it got the message out. And, Phil, being a liberal, and I think Helen can vouch for that, had a very sympathetic ear the whole time. I think a lot of the media were not very sympathetic, and you can clearly say that he really gave us a platform to stand on. And before there was Oprah and these other people, there was Phil. He was really the #1 talk show host as far as these hot topics like that. So
visibility is so important, because the default for Asian Americans is to be rendered invisible. And then because so many of our community, we get poisoned by that message too. So in a way, we have to decolonize our own communities. I mean, coming together as Asian Americans took a lot of hard work. A lot of people, we had to speak to our various communities when people said, why should we come together? Will we bring more trouble upon ourselves if we speak up? And even today, I know people are saying, should we be having these demonstrations? Should we be speaking about Stop AAPI Hate? Is that just going to bring more hate to us? And so that's where we still always have to fight this tide that says Asians should be quiet, Asians should be silent, Asians don't experience racism. What happened in Atlanta and in Indianapolis, that had nothing to do with race. That's a constant drumbeat about us. And that's partly how Asian Americans experience systemic racism. That is how we are part of white supremacy and that's how we are used by white supremacy. And so the need to speak up and take every possibility, whether it's a TV show, how we best use social media. And I have to say, I think, our Asian American community really rose up in terms of this tidal wave of anti-Asian hate in this pandemic to bring attention. If our communities had not been speaking up in social media, I'm sure we would not be getting this the kind of attention, especially after the mass killings in Atlanta and Indianapolis that we have. And so what you millennials are doing that's critical in using the new technology. We only had TV and newspapers, and we were fortunate to be able to get that attention, but we have to use everything we have today to fight the invisibility that's enforced upon us.
I'd like to pivot a little bit and pose a question to Anna Dang and Anna Lin in terms of relating to the DOJ and FBI contacts of an earlier day, just thinking about how the AAPI community might be engaging with law enforcement now on the issues of today, and how we might accomplish that with respect to community policing, re-envisioning law enforcement, that sort of thing. Can you comment on that?
Yeah.
Anna Dang?
I think the answer is a little complicated because obviously with Asian American being, a political coalition, there's just many different approaches to how we view law enforcement. But I can say a bit about kind of my mindset when I'm organizing. And so when I think about the white supremacy that did kill Vincent Shin, and that has been a thing in the US since Asian Americans have existed. And, today is starting to be more centered by Asian Americans and non-Asian people during COVID-19. And there is just such a link between that anti-Asian racism to American colonialism and imperialism, which brings about why there's such deaths like Vincent Shin's. And I think, when we bring colonialism and imperialism into the conversation, there are just many systems of American state violence that are at home and they're abroad, and they're very deeply rooted in, our colonialist country. And to me, Vincent Shin's case is just a reminder that we're in a fight to dismantle those systems. And that's sort of where it can tie to abolition, which I know a lot of people are talking about, because I think there's this question of what is justice? And to me, it's about, making sure there aren't the conditions where things like the murder of Vincent Shin occurred. And it's less about prosecuting individuals and more about changing those conditions. And, I don't want to invalidate the families of people who have lost, loved ones to white supremacy, and who do seek, justice through the carceral system. I think, the way that our country is sort of set up is that it centralizes, the criminal justice system as the only form of justice. And so, we see it as, while I don't think it's the only option, it's sort of framed as the only option for people who have had a lot of options taken away from them. And that truth can exist while we fight for abolition. And it's more about, when there's anti-Asian violence, it should not lead to more anti-Asian violence, which things like cops and prisons and ICE and the military have proven to do over and over again. And that's something that those institutions were based on. And so in these conversations, I always bring it back to, abolition of police and colonialism and capitalism and prisons. It's sort of that decolonization work that we need to center. And so Vincent Shin is a historical example of how these system takes the lives of many marginalized people. And also, while that, racialized hate doesn't need to happen to your community for you to care, it, sort of defines, the way that Asian Americans do have stake in dismantling those systems.
Anna Lynn, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think kind of like how Anna said it is really complicated. And I think my perspective is a little different in that. So I have a lot of conversations with my friends, and I think more so recently with all the rise in the hate towards our community. I think the first one was back in January when we heard how our elders were being hurt in California, and we were having all these talk well, how can we help them, right? And then I started seeing how there were essentially youth, people my age, high school student, college student, kind of organizing within the community and across communities to kind of protect our elders when they're out and walking, because they feel they couldn't really rely on like the police, right? Like the people who we thought could protect our community, our elders, our family, our loved ones, but they couldn't anymore because when we did reach them out for help, they didn't like either they didn't like take us seriously, they couldn't like do anything. We just didn't feel like we're protected. So we kind of took it into our own hands. And so nowadays when like I'm talking about like how we can, I guess, like work with this system, like talk about like defunding the police, like I think it's more of a matter of a mindset of like how can we use the current system we have and like think about it in a different way, because like I believe the police system originally was like I read this, like the history behind it was like it was created in purpose of like slavery, because like slave would escape and you have to like bring them back, and that was kind of like why like the police system existed back then. So if that was the reason why it was created and founded, like and putting in today's context how everything has changed, like it does not make sense, because if the same system applies, then like people of color, we will always be the one that's receiving a lot of injustice. We're never going to get justice in this system because it was created to kind of make us feel lesser and have less power, and never really give us like a chance to kind of speak for ourselves. And kind of like going back to like the whole Vincent Shin case, like we thought the police would like do something. I thought the justice system could do something for us. But like to this day, almost 40 years later, he never received justice, and we still don't have an answer. Like we're still trying and hoping we can get justice. So.
Thank you. Okay, a question for all of the panelists. How and why
Roland, can I just say
certainly.
quickly, I really appreciate both Anna Dang and Anna Lynn's views and thinking on this. I think it was very well said about the issues that are facing our communities today. And I just want to add as an OG here that it's not either or. We are not in a position of having to choose one from the other. Back when we were organizing, we had revolutionaries. We had people who were talking about, the Chinese community was divided over whether to support Taiwan or the People's Republic. And there were people who were advocating against imperialism and for revolution. And for our coalition, we talked about if you want to support justice for Vincent Shin, as long as you agree to support this cause, we welcome all points of view. And what we were fighting for was for accountability and fairness in the system, that with the laws that exist, that we were not in a position of reforming the whole system at that time, even though many of us would have liked that the laws that existed had to be applied fairly, and public officials should be accountable. And I think in today's, there are many people talking about abolish. I think we have to demilitarize, at least start with there. And in the end game, we definitely want to see a dismantling and a whole new vision of America and what justice means for all people. In the meantime, with our communities, we have to have accountability and fairness. So I just wanted to say that as an OG, as part of hearing the debates and how do we protect our communities, all communities, not just Asian Americans, but all communities as the violence sort of continues and is fomented by previous administrations and political demagogues. And how do we get to the end game of dismantling white supremacy? And it's not either or. We have to use every tool that we have to do that.
One thing about, we talk about racism, it's really an old term, but it still applies now. Institutional racism, it's baked in. Political system, economics, education, housing. I mean, there's a whole myriad of things that go into the matrix that really are the biggest barriers for people of color. But as Helen said earlier, you can't attack everyone separate and apart. This is all part of I think a larger movement, a larger concern we have to address that way. And the different points, the one thing we cannot allow to happen is have this sort of divide and conquer in the community. That was one of the biggest barriers we had to overcome back in 1983, was to try to get people to put aside their differences. And I'll give you one example. Dave Chalk, who's a good friend of ours and one of the main volunteers, took the time to write a letter, I think, to one of the, I can't remember if it was the Center Daily News or World Journal, one or the other. And he got blasted because
in Chinese.
In Chinese, but he used simplified characters. And it really made the people that were pro-Taiwan go nuclear on him. And he got really nasty mail like that and kind of threw him aback. And that's the kind of thing we just can't allow. We have differences. You've got people that maybe Sikh and, Hindi and Muslim in the Indian community. You've got people that might be pro, PRC or pro-Taiwan. That doesn't matter. We live in the U.S. You've got to pull this other stuff aside and view that we have a certain environment and framework we have to deal with. And if we fight among ourselves, it's the old divide and conquer. We can't allow that to happen. That's like the worst possible thing. And, common ground is the most important part. I think there's more than enough for us to sink our teeth into as far as getting things done. And I think to the credit of everybody that worked in the case 40 years ago, I think everybody eventually put all their differences aside and just we're pushing all in the same direction, which resulted in the DOJ going forward. But it's a challenge which never goes away. People have their own personal interests and their own agendas, and you have to just say, that's fine, but you have to look at the big picture. We're all the target. Doesn't matter who you are. Nobody asked Vincent Shin, are you Japanese, and now he got killed. He was an Asian, a gook, call it you will, a Jap, Chink, whatever you want to call that. And that's all that really counts in the end.
Thinking about today being Juneteenth and coincidentally the 39th anniversary of the day when Vincent Shin was beaten, do you think that it's just a coincidence of time on the calendar, or are there opportunities to sort of marry the common themes that run through Juneteenth and today being an anniversary day for Vincent Shin? Any thoughts on that?
I'd like to hear from Anna Lynn and Anna Dang.
I guess what I want to say is, well, first of all, I think I'm happy that like our federal government has wanted to recognize as a federal holiday as of Thursday, I believe. I think that's like a great step forward, but at the same time, doing some reflection on that, it's also thinking about like the people, like I believe racial profiling is very real, and I think there's a lot of data to show that racial profiling is very real when it comes to like police interacting with you when they stop you, right? So think about Juneteenth and how it's supposed to be a celebration of emancipation of like, I believe like the last group in Galveston who was finally free because of how slow like news travel back then. Like thinking about like what it's supposed to mean, and then think about like our current system that we have, the whole incarceration system, and how a lot of the people who are incarcerated are from the Black community. Like it's just really mind-baffling how we're taking that as like a holiday to just be off, and yet there are people who it should be about them. It's like their day to celebrate, and it's to be with like their family and loved one that has really significant meaning for them. They don't get to celebrate that. They are in like the prison, and that is not okay. And so I think that is just like another level of thinking and reflection we got to do. Like it's great, we're celebrating it and we're recognizing it, but there's still a lot more because now the meaning has changed. As I've talked to some of my friends, they're like really thinking about like, it's great that we're recognizing it and that more and more people are understanding what Juneteenth means. But the real meaning of Juneteenth is like, do we really know what it means now that we've made it so public for everyone?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I have like mixed feelings about this event being on Juneteenth. If I'm being honest, I mean, I've been to events that have been on like holidays that I celebrate, but aren't nationally recognized. And it is a very erasive experience. And I think to answer this question, like the reason why it's on this day is yes, like Vincent Shin got attacked on this day and died 4 days later. And yes, that can speak to the fact that both Black and Asian communities have experienced racism and Black and Asian communities have solidarities, but I also honor the discomfort of this event being on Juneteenth, being on a Black holiday, because we would be remiss to say there are no fissures between Black and Asian communities, and we would be erasing history to not position Asian Americans as, oppressors to Black communities as well, and to erase the history of, Asian Americans also being white supremacists. So, if people are uncomfortable about this event being on Juneteenth, I honor that and I validate that. Sorry.
Well, thank you. Well, moving on, I just want to throw this question out to all the panelists. How and why does Vincent Shin still matter? If you can just say that in a few words. Why don't we start with Jim?
Vincent Shin, to me, is really, again, a seminal moment for the APA community. Even though it's 40 years ago, the same forces and attitudes that led to his death are still around. And I think it's important that remember Vincent and the heinous nature of the way he was killed. But at the same time, if his legacy means anything at all, we've got to keep the fight going because it continues on. You look what went on in Atlanta and in other places around the country recently, these random attacks on elderly people. It's really the same element throughout all this. And I think it's important that when you look at Vincent and say that hopefully he didn't die in vain. This will provide the inspiration and direction for future generation, particularly with Anna here on the call to pick it up. I think that, Roland and Helen and I have had this 40-year struggle trying to deal with this. And as hard as we've tried individually and as part of the group like ACJ and others, the fight still continues. And I just hope for everyone, don't forget and keep the fight going. It's really the most important thing.
Helen?
It matters because, and I'd like to link back to the previous question too about Juneteenth and today, what we used to call and still call rededication to justice. June every year starting from 1983, the American Citizens for Justice, the group that was formed, and yes, today we would have a different name for it, not American Citizens for Justice, but that group, we would have a rededication to justice. And this is not, why it matters is about the legacy. It's about remembering what happened to Vincent Shin and also how the community came together to fight, to resist, to talk about justice, to reach out to other communities, to build a movement of a civil rights movement of Asian Americans speaking up and talking about racial inequality, about changing a system of racism. And Juneteenth is a day to me also about rededication to the cause of freedom, to recognize the sacrifices that Black Americans have gone through and have stood up for all people. And really, so it may be a coincidence of date, but it is really about communities standing up for the full humanity of all people. And that's why the Vincent Shin case matters today. It's about Asian Americans who have stood up for the full humanity of all people, including Asian Americans who have been excluded because of white supremacy. And to the question of whether Asian Americans are also white supremacists, I would say it's not. Asian Americans are not white supremacists, but some support white supremacy. And we have been put in a position to be in a role to advance. We have been manipulated, and people who accept the model minority racist myth are also being manipulated to see Asian Americans as honorary or wannabe whites. And for those who buy into that, whether we're Asian or not, that is supporting white supremacy. So the Vincent Shin case the legacy of Vincent Shin and why it matters, it's an opportunity for all of us to talk about and reflect on these things and see how we can be part of a movement for all humanity. So this discussion is part of why Vincent Shin matters today.
Points well taken. Anna Lynn, your thoughts?
Yeah, so for me, it matters today because history really repeats itself. And I think we really see that this year with COVID going on, with the language being used. And I think a lot of it does have to do with political context, but also just looking at a bigger picture, right? Looking outside of our community and kind of touching on what Helen said earlier, really coming together across all communities, because while we may be Asian, Black, Latino, and other marginalized community, at the end of the day, there is a collective struggle we face because we're not white at the end of the day. So the color of our skin will always kind of make us second-class citizens. And so there will always be a collective struggle that we face. So by understanding our own history, our own past, it will really help us come together and work with other community members and really fight for our place and our justice that we deserve, because we are as much as American as anyone else in this country, even though our skin color is different.
Thank you. Anna Dang, your thoughts?
Yeah, so I think the way I think about the Vincent Shin case today is that it is a very mobilizing story in history for, young Asian Americans who do want to get involved in the movement broadly. And I also would say, I would use it to encourage young people who do feel invisible and passionate about awareness to, I guess, keep going with the organizing until you do feel supported by, your communities, and engage in ways to uplift our communities that are, autonomous from our oppressors, whether that be through community care, such as, mutual aid, and I guess, using it to not only have awareness, but, also action and, a strong radical political agenda.
Thank you. So parting thoughts, how can we make sure that the public knows about Vincent Shin and his legacy? So any of you want to venture an opinion about how we sustain the legacy? Who'd like to go first?
One thing that is critically important is to have Asian Pacific American history and culture be an integral part of school curriculum, whether it's in grade school, middle school, high school, university. Because for most people, if you're a activist like we are, that's become part of your personal life. But for the average person, even if you're Asian American, this is going to be a rather casual exposure. So the opportunity really is limited to when you take a class, whether it's in high school, college, middle school, whatever the case might be, to understand. And as I'm sure all of us have experienced, when you look at your typical American history book, you might have one paragraph about the Exclusion Act and maybe one paragraph about Japanese American incarceration, and that's it. That's the whole history. And one thing that I think would be critically important is to make sure that we demand our educators and our school systems to include a meaningful Asian Pacific American history unit as part of that. It starts there. If you're going to preserve history, you have to learn from it and be taught it. And that's something that has to be addressed. And then I think this is more Roland's alley, because he is a school board member and has to struggle with this thing constantly. So, but I think that's really a very important first step that way.
Helen, any thoughts about ensuring that legacy?
I think what Anna Dang and Anna Lynn are doing, and a whole generation and the organizers that you work with, that is what we need to go forward. I agree with Jim as far as education, and that education has to take place wherever we are, in our own families, in our communities, in our workplaces, in our, we just, in the media, in social media, everywhere. And so, so having more discussions like this everywhere, and taking that to the classroom, to preschool, to, you know, and it's going to take the kind of organizing that these two outstanding, amazing organizers and the thinking that they're doing, the hard thinking that they're doing, and the hard work they're doing. That's what it's going to take.
Okay, Anna, do you want to comment? You've been complimented.
I mean, I guess
what's happening with the movement from here on to ensure the legacy?
As far as specifically, you know, people knowing about the Vincent Shin case, I think it's very rooted in, at least my experience, Asian American studies. I know that that was definitely something I took a lot of building from the people who came before me, but it's a large lesson in Asian American studies. And so, you know, I go back to knowing that ethnic studies is what brought that knowledge to me in college, and how important it is to have ethnic studies at the K-12 level.
Thank you. I'd like to, go ahead.
I just want to add one thing with this, because Jim and Anna kind of said what I want to say, but something I also learned is that not everyone is like at the same level as you are. So I guess to all of like our attendees, what I want to say is like, you know about this case, tell your friends, right? Because they may not know, and maybe they probably think like, well, why do I care? But when it's coming from someone that they're friends with, someone they know, they will listen to you, and then maybe through the conversation you have, they will do their own research and start caring, and then start passing on that word. Because not everyone is an activist, right? And I think activist takes many forms. So everyone looks at activism differently and thinks about it differently. So I think the first step in kind of keeping that legacy on is, if you know about it, tell your friends about it, because they may not know about it. And then maybe through their own learning, they'll tell it to other people. And then the next thing you know, it'll keep growing. So that's another way outside like our fight to get things into our curriculums, because it's really hard. And then some of the current like curriculums we have, they're not really funded by schools or universities. Like they're facing cuts with ethnic studies and all these programs. So I think at the end of the day, you having that knowledge and sharing with others is going to be also really key in just keeping this legacy alive and making sure we're still having these hard conversations.
Well, thank you very much. I want to take a question from the audience. The question being, what concrete actions should we take to leverage our experience as AAPIs to change the culture in the US to be more inclusive? So anyone want to tackle that?
That's a complicated question to answer. I mean, they're
multifaceted.
Exactly. I mean, there's so many things you can do. You can be like Anna mentioned earlier, talking to people is a very important part of it, but also being engaged. I mean, if you're, again, unfortunately, curriculum is very local. If your school district where you live isn't including APA studies as part of the curriculum, you need to talk to the school board, principals. Because again, these decisions are being made at the local level for the most part, and you've got to be heard that way. Also, be vigilant. If you find out that kids are being harassed or being bullied, don't be afraid to stand up. And there are groups out there, you know, that are part of the APA civil rights community that would be happy to step forward. If you feel like you can't take on the fight individually, there are people that will help you. As far as the workplace, it's a much more difficult situation because for anyone, I don't care who you are, if you fight back, that can cost you your job. And employers tend to be very draconian and very, very retaliatory. So again, there are lawyers and groups that are out there that service the APA community that you would turn to like that. But more than anything else, I think you've got to educate yourself. I think for a lot of APAs, we ourselves are our own worst enemy. We don't take the time to self-educate, to understand the issues, understand the history. I think, like was mentioned earlier, I think it starts with the individual. You have to be aware, be sensitive, understand the issues before you can actually venture out and to advocate and convince other people. So I would suggest anyone who has a motivation, take the time, educate yourself, do the reading, talk among your friends. Have study groups or have whenever you have even simply just casual conversation. These are all very important steps towards trying to build a sense of community consciousness. Very important that way.
And one last question is, what is the importance of having a rally, whether it's in Kennedy Plaza at the time of the Vincent Shin case, or all the rallies that have been happening just in the last couple of months or so post Atlanta? Anyone want to comment about the importance of those rallies?
As someone who has, I guess, towards the end of my undergrad career, put a vigil/rally together in light of the shootings in Atlanta, I think there's sort of a couple goals with having such an event, especially, I guess now, like, things are changing with the pandemic, not that they've fully changed, but at the time, during a very dangerous time to gather. And I think one piece is the grieving aspect, and for communities to be able to come together and know they're not alone and support each other. And I think the other aspect of a rally is the mobilizing and education aspect. So in our grief, how do we channel these feelings into change, into thinking, as a political collective on such an issue. So yeah, that sort of dual goal of supporting each other and also helping each other learn.
Thank you. Okay, as we address resistance, remembrance, and renewal, any last words that you'd like to impart to the audience? Helen?
Keep on raising our voices. Do all of whether it's a demonstration and organizing a demonstration that Anna's talked about, going to Anna Dang, or getting our friends and people who may not be in the same place as we are to recognize what today represents, or any of these incidents, and in whatever networks and positions we are in, to keep on raising our voices, to tell this story and more, and about the connectedness of our community to all others, and why we must all stand up for the full humanity of all people and to work at it. That's what today represents to me. And that's what we need going forward. Thank you. Thank you all. I just want to say how much I appreciate all of you and pulling this discussion together, and all the work that everyone here is doing.
Thank you. Jim?
Well, I'll keep my comments short, but to quote the late, great John Lewis, be allowed to make good trouble. I think the worst thing we can do is being silent. You've got to raise your voices. If it means having to have a protest rally, if it means having to meet with politicians and law enforcement, if it means having to talk to academics on a broad landscape. But make good trouble. Don't be silent. I think that we've always been called a silent minority. That's got to end. It's been a historic problem. It's a very counter to our culture, generally speaking, because we're into Zen and harmony. But the point is, we've got to be disharmonious in order to get things done. And as a matter of course, you just have to kind of lift yourself up and say, I'm willing to raise hell, raise my voice, and put up the good fight.
Anna? Anna Lynn and Anna Dang? Last words?
I think about these 3 words because that's what Apostle uses on campus as kind of our slogan, is active, present, and aware. I think right now more than ever, we may not be able to be as active as we like because of the pandemic, but you can still be present, right, with our social media. And then you can also still be really aware with all of our technology that we have, than talking to your friends. So I guess just like a word of reminder, like if you sometimes think you're not doing anything, where you can't do anything, there's still like alternatives to doing things, because we may not always be able to go to a rally, we may not always be able to attend certain events, but do what you can within your own capacity And that will still go a really long way to help others and also in like educating yourself.
Anna, you have the last word.
I guess, in talking about the legacy of Vincent Shin and how it's been foundational to a lot of Asian American studies and Asian American organizing, not only uplift Vincent Shin's narrative, but think about the many lenses that we can look at Asian American history and Asian American organizing through, and the many stories that there are, especially of a lot of the communities within the Asian American label that are marginalized. So I think, the Vincent Shin case is a opportunity for us to, think about everyone else and, the fight for collective liberation.
Well, thank you very much. I want to thank Anna Lin, Anna Dang, Helen Zia, and Jim Shimura for being great panelists and carrying the message. I want to thank all the audience for your participation today. And also I want to thank Ian Shin, whom I teach with in the Department of American Culture at U of M, who organized this panel, and to David Liu, who's behind the scenes and doing all the technology, and Mei-Chi Chu, who did the translation. So I just want to thank all of you and thank the audience for participating, and have a good June 19th, and have a good day. Thank you very much.
All right. Thanks all.